This isn't humility, it's a disclaimer. When an avoidant says this early, it often sounds self-aware, even honest. It can trigger empathy in you, make you soften, lean in, and think, they're trying to be transparent. But psychologically, this statement is not a confession. It's a preemptive defense. What they're really doing is lowering the bar before anything has begun, quietly redefining the rules so that inconsistency, emotional withdrawal, and unmet needs are framed as personality traits rather than choices. It's a way of saying, don't expect repair, don't expect growth, don't expect me to stretch when things get uncomfortable. And once that sentence is on the table, every future disappointment can be traced back to it, as if you were warned and therefore complicit. The dynamic subtly shifts. Instead of two people co-creating a relationship, you become the emotional manager, the translator, the one who adapts. You start justifying behavior that hurts you by telling yourself they didn't mean it, or that this is just how they are. Over time, your standards quietly shrink while their comfort expands. You explain things more gently, ask for less, wait longer, forgive faster. You stop naming your needs clearly because you don't want to overwhelm someone who already told you they're bad at this. That's how emotional offloading works. Not through cruelty, but through quiet abdication. The avoidant doesn't have to actively reject closeness. They simply never take responsibility for maintaining it. And the most dangerous part is that this disclaimer feels reasonable. It doesn't sound like rejection. It sounds like vulnerability. But vulnerability seeks connection and accountability. A disclaimer seeks insulation. It protects them from the discomfort of being seen as capable of hurting you. It also protects them from the expectation to do better. If you stay, the relationship becomes asymmetrical. You bring patience, curiosity, emotional labor, and self-reflection, while they bring honesty about their limitations and little else. The pain you experience later will be reframed as unfortunate but unavoidable rather than the result of misalignment. Walking away at this point isn't about punishing them or proving a point. It's about recognizing that someone who defines themselves by their incapacity to relate is telling you very clearly that your emotional needs will eventually be positioned as excessive. Love does not begin with a warning label. Healthy connection starts with a willingness to learn, to repair, to be impacted by another person. When someone tells you they're not good at relationships, believe the structure they're offering you, one where you will be asked to carry what they refuse to develop. Space is healthy. Excessive space is avoidance in disguise. On the surface, this sounds mature, reasonable, even secure. After all, everyone needs autonomy, but when an avoidant emphasizes a lot of space early or repeatedly, it's rarely about balance. It's about nervous system protection. What they're really saying is that emotional proximity overwhelms them, and distance is how they regain a sense of control. This isn't a mutual rhythm that's negotiated together. It's a unilateral requirement that sets the pace entirely on their terms. And once that pace is established, you're expected to adapt to it without complaint. When space is requested without accompanying reassurance, without clarity, timelines, or emotional anchoring, it leaves you in a state of low-grade uncertainty. You're technically in the connection, but you're not held within it. You're waiting, watching, and regulating yourself so you don't appear needy, demanding, or intrusive. Over time, you start doing emotional math in your head. How long should I wait before reaching out? Am I asking for too much? Should I give them more room so they don't pull away further? That's the quiet cost of excessive space. Connection becomes conditional. Intimacy happens when they feel safe enough to engage, and retreat happens the moment emotional intensity rises. You learn that closeness has an expiration date, so you ration yourself. You share less. You bring problems up carefully, or not at all. You become skilled at emotional containment, because expressing need seems to threaten the bond. Meanwhile, they experience relief. Distance soothes their system. They feel calm, unpressured, unburdened, and often mistake that calm for compatibility. But compatibility doesn't require one person to disappear so the other can stay regulated. A relationship that only works when one partner shrinks is not balanced. It's asymmetrical. The most subtle manipulation here isn't intentional cruelty, it's the unspoken rule that you must remain emotionally available while accepting emotional absence in return. You're expected to understand their need for space, but your need for consistency is quietly framed as a problem to manage. And if you voice discomfort, it's often reframed as pressure, expectation, or lack of independence. This creates an emotional one-way street. You stay attuned, patient, and responsive while they drift in and out of presence without accountability. Walking away at this point isn't about being intolerant of individuality or autonomy. It's about recognizing when space has become a stand-in for emotional unavailability. Healthy space expands connection. It doesn't replace it. In a secure dynamic, distance is paired with reassurance, return, and repair. When space only leads to more distance and you're the only one waiting at the edge, it's not self-care, it's avoidance, dressed up as maturity. Invalidation sounds calm when it's practiced. This phrase is rarely said with anger. That's what makes it so effective and so damaging. When an avoidant tells you you're overthinking it, they're not engaging with what you're feeling. They're quietly disqualifying it. The tone is often relaxed, almost reassuring, as if they're offering perspective. But psychologically, this statement functions as a shutdown. It closes the conversation without resolving anything, because it reframes emotional awareness as excess rather than information. Instead of curiosity, you're met with minimization. Instead of repair, you're offered dismissal wrapped in composure. The message beneath the words is clear. Your interpretation is the problem, not my behavior. And once that idea takes root, the imbalance deepens. You begin to second guess yourself. You replay conversations in your head, wondering if you really are making too much out of things. You soften your language, dilute your concerns, and preface your feelings with apologies. I might be wrong. Maybe I'm just sensitive. I don't want to overthink this. But meanwhile, they remain unexamined. Their behavior doesn't need to change if your reaction can be labeled as irrational. Over time, this erodes trust in your own perception. You stop seeing your emotions as signals and start seeing them as obstacles. That's not growth, that's self-abandonment. And for the avoidant, this dynamic feels safe. Emotional intensity is deflected without confrontation. Accountability is avoided without conflict. They don't have to explain themselves, reflect, or risk discomfort. All they have to do is stay calm and imply that you're the one spiraling. The most insidious part is that this doesn't look abusive on the surface. There's no raised voice, no overt cruelty, just a repeated pattern where your inner experience is quietly invalidated. But emotional safety isn't about tone, it's about responsiveness. Someone who cares about you doesn't need to fully agree with your interpretation to take it seriously. They ask questions, they seek understanding. They stay present long enough to repair. When you're overthinking it becomes a reflex, it signals a refusal to enter your emotional world. It keeps intimacy at arm's length by turning your awareness into a liability. And if you stay, you'll likely find yourself doing more emotional labor to be understood while receiving less in return. Walking away here isn't about being dramatic or intolerant. It's about earning your right to perceive, feel, and respond without being subtly corrected out of your reality. Anyone who consistently frames your emotional awareness as a flaw isn't trying to help you regulate. They're trying to maintain distance without appearing distant. Avoidants don't fear labels, they fear accountability. At first, this statement can sound progressive, even enlightened. It's often framed as a rejection of pressure, tradition, or unnecessary rules. But psychologically, when an avoidant resists labels, it's rarely about freedom in the mutual sense. It's about avoiding definition. Labels don't just name a connection, they create orientation. They clarify what two people are to each other, what level of care is implied, and what behavior is no longer optional. For someone with avoidant patterns, that clarity can feel like confinement. The moment something is named, expectations follow: consistency, consideration, emotional presence. And those expectations activate their threat response. So instead of negotiating a shared understanding, they opt for ambiguity. Ambiguity allows them to stay close enough to receive emotional benefits while remaining undefined enough to retreat without consequence. You, on the other hand, are left in a state of suspended investment. You're emotionally engaged, but structurally unsupported. You're giving energy, time, and vulnerability into something that has no agreed upon container. Over time, this creates a quiet imbalance of power. They hold flexibility, the ability to redefine, withdraw, or downplay the connection at any moment, while you carry the emotional weight of not knowing where you stand. And because nothing is labeled, nothing is technically being violated when your needs go unmet. You're not being neglected, you're just misaligned. You're not being strung along, you're just reading too much into it. That's how ambiguity becomes self-protective for them and destabilizing for you. You start monitoring yourself. You hesitate before asking questions that might push things. You tell yourself it's too early, too much, too demanding, even when your needs are reasonable. The relationship never progresses, but it doesn't end either. It hovers, and hovering is exhausting. The most dangerous part is that this dynamic often masquerades as patience. Now, you convince yourself that labels will come later, once things feel safer for them. But safety in this case is defined as not being asked to commit emotionally. So later never arrives. Instead, ambiguity becomes the relationship itself, not a transitional phase. It becomes the environment you adapt to. And adaptation looks like emotional contortion, lowering expectations, interpreting mixed signals generously, and accepting inconsistency as nuance. Meanwhile, they get the comfort of connection without the responsibility of stewardship. Walking away here isn't about forcing definitions or demanding certainty prematurely. It's about recognizing when someone is unwilling to co-create clarity at any point. Healthy relationships can move slowly, but they still move. They allow questions. They welcome definition when emotional investment increases. Someone who consistently resists labels while benefiting from closeness is telling you they want the privileges of intimacy without the obligations. That's not freedom, that's asymmetry. And staying in that space teaches you to live without footing, always adjusting, never grounded. Choosing to leave is choosing alignment over ambiguity and self-respect over indefinite waiting. Independence is healthy until it's used to avoid interdependence. This phrase is often delivered with pride, as if emotional distance is a virtue rather than a defense. And in truth, independence is healthy when it exists alongside connection, not instead of it. But when an avoidant emphasizes how independent they are, what they're usually describing isn't self-sufficiency. It's emotional self-reliance taken to an extreme. A system built around not needing, not leaning, not being affected. For them, independence feels like safety. It means no one has leverage, no one can disappoint them, and no one can ask for more than they're prepared to give. The problem is that relationships don't thrive on parallel lives that never intersect emotionally. They thrive on interdependence, the ability to influence each other, rely on each other, and matter to each other in ways that change behavior. When someone insists on radical independence, they're quietly drawing a boundary around their inner world and labeling it maturity. You're welcome in their life, but only up to a point. You can share time, conversation, even affection, but not consequence. Your feelings are allowed, but they don't alter their choices. Your presence is enjoyed, but it doesn't shape their priorities. Over time, this creates a strange, hollow experience of closeness. You're there, but you're not impactful. You don't factor into decisions in a meaningful way. And that absence of influence slowly erodes your sense of connection. You begin to feel optional, interchangeable, peripheral, not because they say you are, but because nothing you bring into the relationship requires adjustment on their part. The avoidance extreme independence often comes from a deep discomfort with need, both theirs and yours. Needing someone feels like vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like loss of control. So they keep themselves structurally insulated, They handle things alone, process alone, decide alone. And when you express a desire to be included, it's subtly framed as dependence, pressure, or a threat to their autonomy. You start shrinking your expectations to avoid being seen as clingy. You tell yourself that asking for emotional consideration is asking too much. Meanwhile, you're doing the very thing they refuse to do, adapting. You're bending toward them while they remain unchanged. That's the quiet drain of connection, without influence. It looks stable on the outside, but internally it's lonely because intimacy isn't just about sharing space. It's about allowing someone to matter. Walking away at this point isn't a rejection of independence. It's a refusal to participate in a dynamic where closeness has no weight. Healthy independence doesn't block interdependence. It supports it. It says, I can stand on my own, and I still choose to let you affect me. When someone insists on independence as an identity rather than a balance, they're telling you that your role will always be limited. Choosing to leave is choosing a relationship where your presence doesn't just coexist, it counts. Confusion can be a strategy. When someone says this, it's often framed as honesty, a vulnerable admission of uncertainty, and on the surface, it can trigger compassion. You might think they're just figuring themselves out, or at least they're not lying. But in avoidant dynamics, I don't know what I want is rarely neutral. It's a position that creates maximum flexibility with minimum responsibility. Not knowing buys time without commitment. It allows the relationship to continue without direction while emotional benefits are still being received. They get connection, validation, companionship, and emotional regulation, all without having to make a decision that would require consistency or accountability. You, meanwhile, are placed in a holding pattern. Waiting becomes the structure. You stay hopeful that clarity will arrive with enough patience, enough understanding, enough time, and while you're waiting, you're investing. You're imagining futures, making emotional space, orienting your choices around the possibility of something solid, eventually forming. But the longer this uncertainty persists, the more one-sided the investment becomes. Confusion becomes a shield. It prevents you from asking for more without sounding demanding. Because how can you expect direction from someone who's still figuring it out? Your needs get postponed indefinitely, and postponement is a powerful form of avoidance because nothing has to be refused outright. It's all just not yet. The avoidant doesn't have to say no, they just never say yes. This dynamic slowly erodes your sense of agency. You stop asking direct questions. You learn to read between the lines, to interpret moods, to look for signs of progress that may or may not exist. You start negotiating with time instead of reality. Meanwhile, they remain comfortable in ambiguity. Ambiguity keeps their nervous system regulated. Decisions create pressure. Pressure creates threat. So they stay undecided while continuing to receive the warmth of connection. The most painful part is that this often doesn't come with cruelty. They may genuinely care about you. They may enjoy you deeply, but enjoyment without intention is not a foundation. Caring without direction still leaves you unsupported. And over time, you'll notice that the confusion never resolves, because resolving it would require choosing, and choosing would require risking closeness or loss. If someone truly doesn't know what they want, they create space to figure it out without pulling someone else into limbo. They pause, reflect, and return with clarity. When confusion stretches on while intimacy continues, it stops being a phase and starts being a pattern. Walking away here isn't about impatience or ultimatums. It's about self-respect. It's about recognizing that you don't need to wait to be chosen by someone who can't orient toward you. If someone doesn't know what they want with you, that information is already meaningful. It tells you that your presence isn't anchoring enough to inspire direction, and staying, hoping clarity will magically appear, only teaches you to accept uncertainty as love. Choosing to leave is choosing clarity over potential and yourself over indefinite waiting. The flow always leads away from attachment. This phrase sounds easy, open, and non-threatening. It carries a tone of calm detachment, as if pressure itself is the enemy of connection. And early on, it can feel refreshing. no expectations, no labels, no demands. But structurally, going with the flow is unbound. There is no direction, no shared intention, no agreement about where things are headed or how emotional investment will be handled along the way. In avoidant dynamics, this isn't an invitation to mutual presence, it's a way to avoid orientation. The relationship becomes something that happens rather than something that's chosen. And when nothing is chosen, nothing is protected. You begin adapting to momentum instead of values. You adjust your pace, your needs, your hopes, so they don't disrupt the flow. Meanwhile, they drift comfortably, engaging when it feels good and pulling back when intensity rises. The asymmetry forms quietly. You're tracking the connection while they're just experiencing it. And because there's no agreed structure, every withdrawal can be framed as organic. Distance isn't a decision, it's just how things unfolded. This makes it almost impossible to address. If you ask for clarity, you risk being labeled controlling or impatient. If you express discomfort, you're told to relax, to stop overthinking, to trust the process. But the process is undefined, and undefined systems always benefit the person with less emotional investment. Over time, you start to notice that the flow never moves toward deeper attachment. It circles comfort, avoids friction, and bypasses conversations that would anchor the bond. You're encouraged to stay present but not attached, invested but not oriented. That's an exhausting paradox. You find yourself suppressing the very instincts that signal connection, wanting reassurance, consistency, progression, because those instincts are framed as disruptions. And the more you adapt, the less you're actually. The relationship becomes a place where your flexibility is praised, but your needs are inconvenient. When the avoidant pulls back, it's described as natural ebb and flow. When you lean in, it's described as pressure. The narrative is subtle but powerful. Closeness is optional, distance is normal. And eventually you internalize that story. You stop asking where things are going. You stop expecting follow through. You tell yourself that if it's meant to deepen, it will, ignoring the reality that deepening requires intention. Walking away here isn't about forcing outcomes or rushing connection. It's about recognizing that flow without direction is not neutrality. It's avoidance with plausible deniability. Healthy relationships can unfold organically, but they still involve conscious choices. They include moments of alignment, conversation, and commitment to mutual care. When someone insists on just going with the flow, what they're often protecting is their ability to disengage without explanation. And staying teaches you to accept passivity as romance. Choosing to leave is choosing agency. It's choosing a connection where movement is mutual, direction is shared, and closeness isn't something you drift into. It's something you decide to build. Readiness isn't about timing, it's about capacity. This sentence often arrives gently, sometimes even apologetically. It can sound considerate, as if they're protecting you from future disappointment. And in a way, they are, but only if you're willing to listen to what's actually being said. I'm not ready for something serious is rarely about external circumstances or temporary phases. In avoidant dynamics, it's an admission of limited emotional capacity. It means the internal structures required for consistency, vulnerability, and repair aren't available, and may not become available simply because more time passes. Readiness isn't something you wait into existence. It's something built through willingness to engage discomfort. When someone says they're not ready, they're telling you where their ceiling is. And if you stay, you're implicitly agreeing to live beneath it. You start negotiating with yourself. You tell yourself that love requires patience, that timing matters, that if you just don't pressure them, things might change. But patience only works when there's movement. Here, there's a boundary. They're offering honesty about what they cannot provide. Depth, commitment, long-term orientation, while still wanting access to connection on lighter terms. The imbalance forms when your capacity exceeds theirs. You're ready to invest, to build, to show up consistently. They're ready to enjoy, to connect episodically, to retreat when intensity rises. Staying means constantly managing the gap between what you want and what they can offer. And that gap doesn't close on its own. It widens. You'll find yourself minimizing your needs, telling yourself that wanting more is unreasonable given their stage. You'll frame your longing as impatience, your desire for security as pressure. Over time, you adapt downward. You accept less contact, less clarity, less effort, and call it understanding. Meanwhile, they remain comfortable because nothing is being asked of them that exceeds their capacity. The most painful part is that this can coexist with affection. They may care about you deeply, they may enjoy your presence, but care without readiness still leaves you unsupported. Emotional limitation doesn't become less limiting because feelings are present. And if you stay long enough, you risk internalizing the belief that love requires you wait in uncertainty to mute your readiness so someone else doesn't feel overwhelmed. Walking away at this point isn't about rejecting honesty. It's about honoring it. They told you the truth about what they can't give. Choosing to stay is choosing to want less than you're capable of giving. And calling that sacrifice growth, choosing to leave is choosing alignment. It's recognizing that your readiness isn't a flaw and your desire for something serious doesn't need to be postponed to accommodate someone who isn't built to meet you there. Love isn't about convincing someone to be ready. It's about meeting someone whose capacity matches your own. The but is where the truth lives. When an avoidant says, I care about you, but it often sounds gentle, considerate, even loving. On the surface, it feels like reassurance. They are expressing affection while attempting to soften a boundary, a limitation, or an impending disappointment. But the moment you hear that but, everything shifts. The first part of the sentence, I care about you, offers warmth and emotional safety. It makes you want to trust them, to stay, to lean in. But the second part, the but, is the pivot, the subtle reveal of reality. Their behavior, limitations, or choices will not align with the emotional truth their words suggest. This is where emotional confusion thrives. Affection without follow-through is one of the most destabilizing experiences in avoidant dynamics because it keeps hope alive while action remains absent. The avoidant can feel kind without ever having to become consistent, responsible, or emotionally available in a measurable way. You begin to notice the pattern moments of connection, tenderness, or warmth are always followed by withdrawal, distance, or evasiveness. The but acts as a disclaimer, a preemptive excuse for why emotional inconsistency isn't neglect. It reframes absence, delay, or indifference as normal, necessary, or out of their control. You stay because you want to reconcile the two, the caring words and the unchanging behavior, hoping the connection will eventually match the affection. But this hope is systematically sustained, not fulfilled. Over time, it erodes trust, not because they are cruel, but because they have mastered the art of plausible emotional deniability. You're never entirely wrong for wanting more, yet you're never fully met either. The danger is that the phrase masks avoidance behind kindness. It allows them to feel morally correct and emotionally generous without challenging themselves to meet your needs. And because the warmth feels real, you keep returning to it, interpreting it as progress, growth, or promise. But true emotional growth isn't punctuated by buts. Growth is measurable in behavior, consistency, and impact. When someone repeatedly offers affection with an accompanying limitation, the dynamic teaches you to accept compromise that feels like a permanent adjustment rather than a temporary accommodation. You start adapting, you minimize your desires, you negotiate your boundaries. You soften expectations, hoping that patience and understanding will eventually bridge the gap between words and actions. The truth is, it rarely does. The but preserves distance while maintaining emotional connection, enough to keep you engaged. Walking away here isn't a rejection of their kindness, nor a refusal to see their care. It's an acknowledgement that love requires more than words. It requires alignment between feeling and action, care and consistency, intention and impact. If someone consistently qualifies their affection with a but, they are signaling that their presence will always be conditional. Staying teaches you to accept ambiguity as intimacy, warmth as stability, and partial care as complete connection. Leaving, by contrast, restores clarity. It recognizes that your needs are legitimate, that affection without action is not sufficient, and that hope alone cannot sustain a balanced mutual relationship. The but is where the truth lives. And once you see it, you know whether it's time to stay or time to walk away.